Okay, afternoon everybody. This is stop one on our Geology 265-365 field trip, geological hazards. So we've got 3 stops today, and we're going to have 2 of them looking at earthquake faults, active faults, and 1 looking at big landslide, Abbotsford landslide. So right now we are standing at a site where we can see the Akatore fault. The Akatore fault is along the skyline behind me here, where you can see the macrocarpa tree on the left, and you can see at the skyline you've got a lot of little shrubs, and that area of skyline is slightly higher than where we are here, and there's a little hillside over there. So that's actually the fault scarp of the Akatore fault. That's an active fault scarp. And this fault is only a close distance to Dunedin, about 15 kilometres from Dunedin. We're in Taieri Mouth, but the fault extends offshore quite close to Dunedin, and to the south it goes down and hits the coast at Tokomariro Mouth. Now, so the Akatore fault, it's quite significant because it's the closest active fault to Dunedin, and from lectures you'll know that when I talk about an active fault, it's a fault that has had movement in the recent geological past and is going to have movement again. The Akatore fault is Otago's most active fault. We've done work on this fault in recent years, and there was some work done in the early days, but the recent work we've showed that this fault has had 3 earthquakes in the Holocene, which is the geologically recent period, the last 10,000 years, but 2 of those earthquakes happened 1,000 years ago, thereabouts. So for Otago, that's really, really active. Otago, it's an area where we generally have these faults, reverse faults, so your compressional faults, but they're very slow moving. You know, usually your earthquakes are every 5,000 to 30,000 years, whereas this thing's been pumping off earthquakes in the last 10,000, and in fact in about 1,000 years ago. So it's a bit of a concern for us in Dunedin, because an earthquake on this fault would be very damaging for Dunedin, and there hasn't been any such earthquakes in Dunedin's 180-year history. So I would have walked you over to the fault here, because they've put a road through it there, and when you go through the cutting there you can actually see some of the distorted sediments on the fault. This is an interesting place because obviously in the area around here you've got lifestyle blocks, so there's people actually building on this fault line, and you know, that's something that if we were in the States, in the USA, we wouldn't be doing, because they have the Alcus Priolo Act, which prohibits people building on fault lines. But here we have a housing development right on our most active fault. So what we're going to do is we're going to drive south along the Akatore fault, and we're going to go to one of our trench sites that we dug in 2016, and we found out the earthquake history, those earthquakes I was telling you about. Actually prehistory, because it's prehistoric. So I'll take you to the scarp. We won't be able to show you the trench, but you'll see the fault scarp. Thank you. So this is stop 2 on our Geology 265-365 geological hazards field trip. Where we are now is at the Big Creek site on the Akatore fault, and actually I'm standing right in front of the fault scarp here. This terracey feature right behind us, where the ground abruptly rises up, this is an active fault scarp on the Akatore fault, and it's in the centre of the fault, so we're kind of halfway in the middle of the fault, and it's actually the biggest and most impressive of the fault scarps along the Akatore fault. And this is where we did our trench site, one of our first trench sites in 2016, when I just started my job at the university. What we found on this fault is evidence for 3 earthquakes in the Holocene. I was telling you about that at the last stop. And what those earthquakes have done is produced this impressive 4-metre high fault scarp. This is a very young fault scarp geologically, and you can see, because it's so sharply defined, very steep slopes. And what we found was that underneath there was schist bedrock, our old basement rock for the Otago region, overthrusting very young swamp sediments with pieces of wood and peat in them. And so what's happening at this Big Creek site, it's really interesting, because you have a river, a Big Creek, that is actually flowing downstream and down to the sea through this gap. And this gap is called an antecedent gorge. So the water is flowing from west to east right through the hill, and that's an antecedent gorge. It was there, the stream was there before the Akatore fault started uplifting this range, and so the stream, being Big Creek, was able to keep cutting down as the range uplifted. And how did the range uplifted? It uplifted by earthquakes. From our trench we see the last 3 of those earthquakes. Each event is probably about 2 meters. Fault dips, so the amount of slip is larger than what you see here. You see a 4-meter slip, 4-meter scarp, but each displacement amounts to more than 4 meters in total over 3 events. So every time this fault uplifts, what it does is it creates a dam to the stream. Big Creek gets dammed up. And what happens when you get a stream dammed? You get swamp deposits. So what we saw when we dug into this is swamp deposits over the top of gravel deposits, and then you had more gravel deposits, etc. And those swamp deposits were telling us when the earthquake happened. So it was an amazing trench site and very good age control on those earthquakes. So we're going to walk up the top here just to show you the rest of the story. So we're walking up this 4-meter high scarp up the muddy sheep track. We've got Sage with us, who's now been in a lot of Otago trenches. So here we are, we're up above Big Creek on the downthrown side of the fault. That's called the footwall, and we're now standing on the upthrown side, the hanging wall, and you can see we've now got again a flat plane. The flat plane's 4 meters down compared with here, so this area has been uplifted, and the stream Big Creek goes around here. Now the last earthquake about 1,000 years ago, Big Creek would have got dammed up, formed a swamp, and it's probably took some hundreds of years to get itself re-established through there. The ground is still sort of swampy because you can see swampy vegetation around here, so it hasn't completely recovered from that last earthquake yet. And so in the future, and this is what we're worried about for Dunedin, is when that next earthquake is going to happen. The Akatore fault is in a state of heightened activity compared with what it did pre these 3 earthquakes. Something I didn't mention at Tyree Mouth is the big surface that's broken there is an old marine terrace that's about 120,000 years old. So the only displacements on that, and earthquakes on that 123,000 year old surface, is those 3 earthquakes which we found to be in the last 10,000 years. So it's like you've had 3 earthquakes in a very short time geologically, and then you've had nothing for the previous 100,000 years. That's pretty amazing, and that's a very important topic that we're looking at for seismic hazard, is that faults, especially in low seismicity areas like Otago, tend to behave in a very irregular way, where they're very, very quiet. Then they have not one earthquake, but they have a pulse of earthquakes, and then they go quiet again. And I've got a student, Jonathan Griffin, in my geology department, not my geology department, but who's studying this for his PhD. So it's a concern because earthquakes in low seismicity areas, you know, they're low seismicity, they're very quiet. Suddenly, bang, you've got a big event and all hell breaks loose. So for Dunedin, we sort of look at this at Christchurch as being a possible scenario for Dunedin. So that's the Akatore fault. Hello again, Geology 265-365. This is stop 3 on the geological hazards field trip around the Dunedin area. We're now standing kind of in the middle of the Abbotsford landslide. And the Abbotsford landslide, which as we spin the camera around here, is pretty much all the green area that you see and then a lot of green area that you don't see. Now the Abbotsford landslide occurred in 1979 in August, middle of winter, and it stands as New Zealand's largest urban landslide. We've had bigger landslides, even like earthquake generated landslides and stuff like that, but this is the largest one to occur in an urban area. And it wasn't earthquakes that caused this landslide, it was a whole series of factors. And so it's called the Abbotsford landslide because it happened in the suburb of Abbotsford and radically changed the suburb of Abbotsford forever. The area that we're in here was once covered with houses. Abbotsford town, Abbotsford suburb, everywhere where we are now was covered in houses and well up the hill, and it all slipped away. Now what happened here, it was a series of factors that all resulted in a landslide. Okay, so one of the main factors that set up the Abbotsford landslide was the geology of the area. The geology is underlain by the Dunedin sedimentary sequence, or the Dunedin sequence. It's a bunch of tertiary mudstones, siltstones, sandstones and limestones. And the particular situation for Abbotsford was that you had the Abbotsford mudstone, which, as the name indicates, was a mudstone which is a very poor, a unit of very poor strength, especially when it's wet. A lot of the hills that are underlain in the Dunedin area by Abbotsford mudstone, you can see evidence of old landslides and soil creep features, ripply landscape. Now under here we had the Abbotsford mudstone, and it was, on top of it was the Green Island loose sand. And that was as the name again suggests, a sandstone, a very porous sandstone, very good, very nice sandstone for excavation for gravels. And so the thing that would happen would be that when you had rain, water would go down through the Green Island loose sand, but it wouldn't be able to get through the Abbotsford mudstone. And so what would happen is that the Abbotsford mudstone would clog up with water and get very, very weak. And you would get instability. So that was the geology. The other thing is the way that geology lies, how it's deformed. Everything dips, all the layers all dip down towards the valley. So that makes this entire slope a dip slope. So when you've got a dip slope and you've got weak rocks, you get gravitational effects which will allow those rocks to deform downhill. So that's actually a regional dip on all these rocks. We also see that dip in the Akatore fault area, but we see it in hard rock, so there's no problems down there. Here it's soft rock dipping down into the valley where the motorway and the railway line is. Now that's factor 2. You've got gravity, you've got poor rock conditions. The third thing is that when humans came along, what did they do down there in the 70s? They dug at the base of the hill to build the motorway and the railway line. So they dug away the base of the hill and oversteepened it and made it more unstable. That's the third thing that contributed to the instability of this hillside. Fourth thing, there's a quarry down there where they were quarrying the Green Island loose sand for for gravel. It's nice gravel for using in various places, sort of reddish, yellowish gravel, you know, you sometimes see it in people's gardens. So they dug away at the bottom of the hill to excavate. So that made the land unstable as well. So what happened in August 1979, and in the months preceding it, there was heavier than normal rainfall. And so you got extra groundwater going down into the Green Island loose sand, down to the Abbotsford mudstone, and creating really, really weak, muddy Abbotsford mudstone underneath this whole huge area behind me and down the valley. Some months before the landslide happened, cracks were noticed in people's sections, in the houses that were all in this area, and people were worried and they contacted various people, the council, EQC, which was the Earthquake and War Damages Commission at the time, but no one really did anything. It started to appear in the news as some of the cracks got worse and worse, and some of the people started getting quite worried, and eventually you were getting very big cracks opening up in people's backyards, and some houses were getting damaged, and they realized that there was a big issue. But really the evacuation of the area didn't happen till quite late in the piece, and then I think it was August the 8th, in the middle of the night, it took about 15 minutes for this entire area to fail in a huge landslide that went all the way down into the valley and took out half of the Miller Park rugby field down at the bottom. Now, the other thing I should mention is that the landslide was creeping in those months previous, but eventually what happens when you're getting creeping around houses, you'll get electricity wires severed, but more importantly you get water pipes and sewage pipes severed. And as soon as that happened, extra water got down into the geology and wet the Abbotsford mudstone even more, so that things started accelerating, and then it failed in 15 minutes, I think in the middle of the night on August the 8th. No one died because it wasn't a catastrophic sudden landslide. There was lots of warning, and the area was pretty much evacuated beforehand. So that's how the landslide happened. It was natural geology. If you go back even further, from prehistoric time and historic time, what's the other effect here that would have made the area less stable is the Maori and the Europeans burning off the native forest here and exposing the geology. No more trees holding in their roots, holding the land and keeping it stable and stopping the water getting down, percolating deep. That was another effect that I should have mentioned earlier. So in the aftermath, unfortunately EQC, which then was the Earthquake and War Damages Commission, did not do any payouts for this because land stability, i.e. landslides, were not one of the things that they protected against. They protected against earthquake, volcano and war damage. Earthquake and War Damages Commission. After the Abbotsford landslide, 1979, by 1984, the government had got together with the EQC and they extended their coverage to landslide. So that political change happened as a result of this landslide. The other thing that happened was that EQC agreed that they could give coverage for impending disasters. Because the landslide happened very slowly in the months leading up, even though it looked like something bad was going to happen, EQC wouldn't pay. They didn't pay until something had happened. Whereas now, because of that landslide, if you start to see that sort of thing going on, they will pay ahead of time. They'll pay for you to get out of your house. So that was two important political legislative changes that happened as a result of this landslide. So That's the story of the Abbotsford landslide, New Zealand's biggest urban landslide, and not to be forgotten.